Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
Dr. Amanda T. Perry's Becoming Indigenous in Haiti, which examines how a new nation defines itself in the aftermath of revolution, colonialism, and the ongoing global interpretation. The work considers Haiti as the world's first Black republic and a space where identity, belonging, and indigeneity are continually negotiated. It raises important questions about how Haitians understand their connection to African roots, Indigenous Taíno presence, and the post-colonial nation building. This discussion invites us to reflect on how nation identity is formed, remembered, and reshaped over time. So let's have a listen. Thank you for coming on to the podcast, Dis Affamie History, Dr. Amanda Perry, discussing your article, Becoming Indigenous in Haiti, from Dessalines to La Revenue Indigène. Now, this was an interesting play on words in terms of during the time of revolution in Haiti, where they had identified themselves as being Indigenous. And so before we start, I'll just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself, and then we'll start with the podcast.
Great. So yes, my name's Amanda Perry. I focused in my research on Caribbean literature and history in English, French, and Spanish. I finished my PhD in comparative literature at NYU several years ago, and I now teach in Montreal at Concordia and Champlain College, Saint-Lambert. This article is older research it's going back about a decade now. My current research focuses actually on the Cuban Revolution and its resonance among Caribbean intellectuals in the 1960s and 1970s. So I'm very close to a book contract with that research here. So,
congratulations.
Thank you. It's not official yet, and hopefully in a couple months it will be.
No problem. So I know that the article begins, with this watershed moment in 1804 in Haiti, in the independence, and of course, after the 13 years of the revolution. So how did independence create the conditions of reimagining formerly enslaved Africans, not simply as liberated subjects, but as indigenous to a new nation?
So this is a really interesting rhetorical detail if you go back and look at the Declaration of Independence. From a contemporary standpoint, I think is quite striking that you see Dessalines constantly referring to the people of Haiti as indigènes, and also referring to the army as l'armée indigène. It actually starts before 1804. It starts in 1801 when we have the army of General Leclerc, the expedition being sent from France, that it is later slowly revealed is there for the purposes of re-enslaving the population. For people who don't know, 1794 is when slavery is abolished within what's then French colonial Saint-Domingue as part of this very long revolutionary struggle. Napoleon gets into power, tries to bring slavery back. And that is when suddenly we start to see this emerging, not from the French, it's not the words the French are using, but from the people who are rebelling against them. They start to refer to themselves as indigènes. And so part of what's really happening here, right, is we've moved into a context where a battle line needs to be drawn, and there are people who need to be declared foreigners and expelled. What's interesting and contradictory about this moment, though, is that, of course, some of the people who are being expelled are white French colonists who've maybe been there for multiple generations, and some of the people who've been doing the expelling, right, are born in Africa. So it's a claim to indigenous status for the purpose of rendering this other group foreign more than anything else that we see happening here. And in other contexts of empire, we might just have that language of liberated subject come up instead of this language of indigeneity. But because they're also struggling for territory and laying a claim to territory, laying a claim to sovereignty, that's part of why I think this particular language is what ends up emerging here.
Yeah. And then what is the importance, or why was it important for Haiti to kind of narrate, Africans as the true founders of a nation, particularly based on their labor, sacrifice, and of course the revolutionary struggle?
So it's interesting because they do and they don't narrate the Africans as the true subjects here. People who were born in Africa. So we have these divisions, right, within the Revolutionary Army. We've got people who were born in Africa and brought over at some point during their lifespan. Saint-Domingue, which becomes Haiti, had a particularly brutal economy in terms of the way that the sugarcane plantations worked. So there are estimates that when the revolutionary process starts in 1791, up to half of the people there were born in Africa. And that's because of the death rates, right? At the death rates and the growth. That's so many people are being brought in. So we have that group. We also have Black people who are born within the colony, and then we have people of mixed race who are born within the colony as well. So we have these three groups that are all kind of brought together under this label of indigene, and it's bridging the differences between them that within the Haitian context are quite substantial, right? And so the African component is absorbed into this, but it's also being kind of neglected within this terminology, you could say. Like they're not bringing in the Middle Passage. They're not bringing in the idea of Africa as a mother country in this moment. Yeah.
No, and I guess, Amanda, within this Haitian context, what does, I guess, for them, indigenous actually mean? Is it just a racial term? Is it a political? Is it territorial? Or is it cultural? Or is it something else?
In this particular moment, during the War of Independence, it's political. It's political, it's territorial. It's, in some ways, I would also say a relational term, by which I mean they're declaring themselves indigenous in relation to the French who they're declaring as foreign. They're also establishing an analogy between themselves and the Taíno. And this comes up in the Declaration of Independence as well. This idea that we need to totally reject everything that's French. Let's follow in the traces, in the footsteps of this other people that preferred to die than be conquered. This is like, I'm paraphrasing one of the lines here from the Declaration of Independence. So you can, it's that kind of analogy that they're making. It's this political situation. There's a similar logic between changing the name from
Mm.
Saint-Domingue, which is the French name, to Haiti, which is understood as the indigenous term. That said, I should say that there are practical consequences to this choice, which one of the major ones being that under some of the 19th century governments, citizenship in Haiti was restricted to people who were of African descent and people who were of indigenous descent. They would use the term Indian in that case, right? So this wasn't just political rhetoric in the sense that it did end up having some practical consequences in terms of this understanding that there's an innate allegiance between people of African descent in the Americas and people who are indigenous. Yeah.
No, thank you so much for that, Amanda. And then we're now going to just touch upon the Taíno, because
Sure.
after independence, Taíno were often described as being disappeared.
Yep.
How did the narratives of the Taíno disappearance, alongside, of course, the Spanish influences, shape the ideological space for Africans to be reframed as indigenous?
So, right. So there's kind of there's a lot going on here within this question, right? One of them is, to what extent were the Taino actually gone?
Mm.
And the archives are contradictory as far as this is concerned.
Mm.
There's a lot of assertions that they've been eliminated. There's also, though, this kind of logic in relation to them that as soon as someone's only part Taino, they're not Taino anymore. It's actually the opposite of the logic that we have towards Blackness, right? There was this sort of obsessive tracing of small percentages of Blackness as excluding someone from whiteness. With indigeneity, it seems that a lot of the observers, I'm thinking of Moreau de Saint-Marie for people who are investigating this history as well, are quite happy to write them out, in part because being indigenous might lead to some claims, right? Might lead to certain kinds of rights. So it's healthy to be a little suspicious of these narratives of absolute appearance, or sorry, of absolute disappearance. After the War of Independence itself, we don't really see a continued claim to being Indigenous among Haitian intellectuals. We do see interesting investigations of the Taino, though, and a kind a kind of cultural memory. And the person that I would point you towards there is a man named Michael Reyes, who's a professor at Queen's University who does a lot of work into this subject in particular. How are these 19th century Haitian intellectuals investigating the Taino? This includes people like Jacques Rouman, who's like one of the most famous Haitian writers, is interested in archaeology and the Taino in that regard. So they are still present in a certain intellectual space, let's say, where people are still thinking about them here.
And I guess my next question, again, it goes to kind of this, how would you say, in terms of the, as you mentioned, it's kind of misrepresented in the, I guess, in the references in the archives, because
Mhm.
your article then refers to the Taino families exercising a limited form of legal autonomy rather than they were just fully assimilated under colonial rule. How does that particular nuance complicate the idea of total Indigenous erasure?
Yes, so I think that specific reference is someone looking back and saying in the mid 18th century, they had a certain kind of legal autonomy. So it does nuance this story. But of course, that writer is then going on to say, but they're not there anymore.
Yeah.
And so I think it requires a different kind of archival research to really dig into the truth of these claims, let's say, like to what extent do we have kind of communities that are still existing during this time period? And that's research that I haven't done in enough
Mhm.
depth to present any conclusions.
Okay.
But it's obviously convenient if
Mhm.
these groups do have a certain degree of legal autonomy at certain points to then declare that they're all gone now, right?
Yeah. So I guess, just one last question just on this one is just,
Mhm.
how should we understand, I guess, the continued Taino presence in the broader Caribbean, particularly in, of course, Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico,
Mhm.
in relation to Haiti's own story?
Yeah, it's another really interesting question. So we have this movement known as the Taino revival in the 1980s, where a lot more people start from the Spanish Caribbean in particular to claim this Taino identity. And there are some reasons to be hesitant about aspects of this. In the Dominican context, of course, there's a really long history of turning towards an indigenous identity as a way of turning away from Blackness, distinguishing themselves from Haiti, approaching Latin America. And I mean, I think probably the most famous example of this is under the dictatorship of Rafael Trujillo, people who are part Black being referred to as Indios.
Mm.
So we see that kind of a mechanism there. So that needs to be kept in mind at the same time as looking into the substantive truths of some of these claims. So yeah, I think it's a complicated question, and I think that yeah, it's a complicated.
Yeah.
It's hard to say.
No, no.
Exactly what to do with this. Because obviously we have this colonial logic that overstates the erasure of indigenous peoples in the interest of being to just able to just claim this territory. But, we're both based in Canada, so we also have seen plenty of examples where claims to being indigenous are suspicious
Yeah.
and are serving other interests. So that's the I'm torn, therefore,
Yes. Yeah.
sometimes as
No.
to approach this question. Yeah.
Yeah, no worries. No, I can appreciate that. And of course, I know that you explored, how indigeneity became intertwined with the ideas of racial purity.
Hmm.
How skin color divisions, particularly between Black Haitians and, of course, their whiter skinned elites, how did that shape in terms of, I guess, the politics of belonging?
So, interestingly here, right, we've got two different things going on. On the one hand, in with these French colonial writers, people like Moreau de Saint-Méry, in order to be Taino, you've got to be pure-blooded Taino, otherwise it doesn't count. So in that sense, we have indigeneity being associated with this kind of racial purity. The way that the revolutionaries are using it is actually to bridge between these two different groups of light-skinned Haitians and dark-skinned ones and those who are born in Africa, which is, of course, becomes a really important political, social division within Haiti, in part because people of mixed race are more likely to have access to more resources. At times, they inherited plantations from white fathers and became slave owners themselves,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So the fact that it's so I think it's worth pointing out that indigène is not noir, right? They're not going just with a straightforward racial term here in order to include these two groups together and rally them underneath this banner.
And, would you say that, indigeneity was meant to kind of unify the nation at that time, or do you think that it kind of created these hierarchies within it?
It was absolute I think it was primarily meant as a unifying device. It was obviously also meant to exclude French colonists, regardless of how many generations they had been on the island. So, it did very much, though, not acknowledge or incorporate the experience of people who were born in Africa, right? So that is what's being glossed over here. Yeah.
And I guess going on that particular theme, because again, you mentioned in terms of with Jean Canu and other diasporic traditions, Afro diasporic traditions, illustrate what you describe, I guess, as the process of indigenization, where displaced African people became rooted and native through culture. Like, is that something that could be used as, I guess, as an identifier in terms of indigenous?
So this is Sylvia Wynter's argument, right? Back in the 1970s, so where this is her interpretation of John Canoe. She's talking about this as a process of indigenization. Melanie Newton, who's at the University of Toronto, critiques this reading as something that's as being an unnecessary step that's foreclosing the idea of thinking about the Taíno themselves, thinking about the actual indigenous populations here. And I think I tend to agree with Newton's critique for the most part. I don't think that the framework of indigenization is the most useful in the Caribbean context. It's certainly not the most popular. People tend to look towards creolization instead. The nice thing with creolization is that it really is emphasizing this creative process that's open to multiple influences, that's incorporating multiple influences and leading to the creation of a new culture. And so that has been a more dominant way of thinking about cultural formation within the Caribbean, I think for good reason. There are some really compelling examples. I'm thinking of the Black Garifuna here, where what we really do have is Afro-diasporic peoples being integrated into an indigenous community and like adopting those languages. And so that I would put in a slightly different category. Maybe there is where I would talk about indigenization. Of course, Winter is drawing on Priest-Mars, Jean Priest-Mars, who's writing in the Haitian context in the 1920s when she's using that term. But even then, I think with the 1920s use of indigène in Haiti, that again, it's during the US occupation. It's again one of those situations where you have a foreigner that you want to have expelled. And so that's a context in which I think this language becomes most powerful and most useful. Outside of that context, we have the Caribbean thinkers have come up with a lot of other terms that I think are perhaps more accurate and more generative.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, again, you argue in the paper, Amanda, that indigeneity in Haiti was deeply wrapped up in national identity. And why was this, I guess, so powerful and perhaps, I guess, kind of necessary for this new Black Republic to claim indigeneity?
It's interesting because it's of course with Dessalines, it's an empire for those first 2 years. It's not a republic. By the time we hit the republic with Pétion in 1806, the language of indigeneity is being dropped, and we've got the national category that's coming in instead here. So, but what I do think that part of the appeal of this indigenous rhetoric is because they're fighting for sovereignty, they're fighting for territory. And so it's a simpler claim. It's more legible within the state system of that time period over elaborate narrative of displacement and labor. So I think that's why it becomes a rallying point during this very specific time period.
Yeah, absolutely. And, what would you say that this essay, kind of teaches us how new nations narrate themselves into being, especially after this violent takeover?
I think it's another example of how new nations will prefer fictions that work
Mm,
over inconvenient truths, right? Or over truths that are too complicated or that are too hard to assimilate. We see this a lot also with this wishing away, I suppose, of white ancestors on the behalf of people of mixed race. I talked briefly about the first Haitian novel, Stella, in this regard too, that has one mixed race character, one black character. They're brothers. It's supposed to be an allegory for how these two groups in Haiti should be coming together, right? And at one point, this involves killing the father of the mixed race character. And it's narrated in such a strange way of kind of distancing them from it, but also he needs to die. So yeah, I think what we're seeing here is this use of this reach towards the fiction that gets us where we need to go.
mhm.
The grappling with the nuance of it can come later after the battle's been won.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, and thank you so much for that because I mean, as we're coming to a close with this episode, how would you say does this history kind of reshape how we should think about, of course, belonging, ancestry, and of course, national identity in the Caribbean, maybe even to today?
I think it's a good reminder how these questions of identity, of belonging are always very, very contextual. And so we have this framework that emerges at these two key moments within Haitian history, the War of Independence, and then again under the U.S. occupation. That's relevant in those moments when there is a clear enemy, let's say, and that then we have other frameworks that come in and take its place outside of it. I think it's also I conclude the essay by bringing this up, a reminder that no one category, no one term is going to work for everything, is going to work in all contexts. That notably, this term doesn't really say anything about what the relationship should be between the state and the people.
Yeah.
It's not incompatible with authoritarian governments, as we see under Dessalines. So that's part of, I think, why it loses some of its usefulness once Haitian sovereignty is established and reestablished in the case of after the U.S. occupation. And I think it's also an example of where this is more maybe of an academic point, but within academia, a lot of the most popular ways and most influential ways of thinking about Caribbean identity tend to come out of either Martinique and Guadeloupe or out of the Anglophone Caribbean. And Haiti is well known for the revolution. Everyone's interested in the revolution, but the particularities of Haitian intellectual history and thought can sometimes get lost. So it's worth digging into those kinds of details, I think, as we think about the way that this region has developed over the years.
No, no, thank you so much for that because again, it's just a different way or a different way to look at this particular word,
Mhm.
indigenous, and then to see it being mean in this type of a context. So I appreciate that you were able to come on and speak to this and to again shed a little bit more light on this particular time during Haiti's development. So I really do appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Perfect.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.